My name is Fair Rogers, and I am 34. I walked into my house in Indianapolis after a 16-hour ER shift, and my 7-year-old daughter was gone. Harper always waits by the door for me. That afternoon, the hallway was empty. I dropped my keys in the ceramic bowl and walked toward her bedroom. The door was locked. From the other side of the wood, I heard a sharp, ripping sound. Someone was pulling the birch forest wallpaper I had painted for her off the drywall in jagged strips. My mother, Brenda, stepped out of the guest room and planted herself in the center of the hallway. She folded her arms across her silk blouse. "She is at her father's house," my mother said. "Sloan is measuring the space for her shipping racks. We decided the room is wasted on toys." I stared at her. My ex-husband Greg lived an hour away in Bloomington and had not asked to see Harper since Christmas. I asked her to unlock the door. "We talked it over," my mother said, her chin lifting. "We voted. You do not get a say." Most people would scream. Most mothers would pound their fists against the wood. I did not. In the emergency room, panic is contagious, and reacting blindly to a symptom only kills the patient. I just looked at the woman who was erasing my child to build a boutique, and I made a quiet decision that would cost them everything they had by Saturday. Welcome back to Aura Vengeance. We tell stories about people who stop keeping the peace and start holding the line. Drop your age in the comments so we know who is listening tonight, and be sure to subscribe. Let me back up, because an empty room does not happen overnight. 3 years ago, my father Tom watched his logistics business fail. The bank took their house. I was working nights, saving every dollar, and I had just closed on a 3-bedroom place in Broad Ripple. It was mine. The deed had one name on it. When they had nowhere to go, I offered them my guest rooms, just until they got back on their feet. My younger sister Sloan came too, because Sloan never paid her own rent if she could avoid it. Just until turned into 3 years. My father got back on his feet and walked straight into my living room recliner, where he spent his days watching game shows. My mother slowly rearranged my life. She moved my coffee mugs. She replaced my living room rug with one she preferred. I let it happen. I was a single mother working 60 hours a week to keep the lights on. Correcting her cost energy I did not have. But Harper's room was our sanctuary. We painted those birch trees together. Harper named the little painted birds hidden in the branches. Now standing in the hallway, I listened to Sloan tearing those birds off the wall. My father was in the living room. He did not look away from the television. He just reached for the remote and clicked the volume up 2 notches. That was Tom, a man-shaped silence. I turned my back on my mother and walked into the kitchen. My cheap drip coffee maker was gone. In its place sat a gleaming chrome espresso machine. I touched the metal casing. It was warm. They were settling in. I pulled my phone from my scrub pocket and walked out the front door. The property lines did not matter right now. The only thing that mattered was Harper. Greg was a checked-out man who treated fatherhood like a dentist appointment he kept forgetting to attend. He did not wake up on a Tuesday and demand custody. Someone made him do it. I sat in my car and dialed his number. He answered on the 3rd ring. The background noise was a cartoon Harper watched when she was anxious. "Tell me exactly what my mother said to you," I asked, keeping my voice level. Greg sighed, the sound of a man caught in a lie he did not invent. "Your mom called this morning," he said. "She told me you were having a mental breakdown from the hospital shifts. She said you needed a week to recover and begged me to take Harper. She even sent me gas money for the trouble." I gripped the steering wheel. Sent gas money. My mother did not just hand my child over to a stranger. She funded the removal. She paid my ex-husband to take my daughter so my sister could have a room to pack lip gloss and leggings. Greg stammered, saying he thought he was doing me a favor, complaining that Harper had been crying for 2 hours. I told him I was on my way. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the neighborhood. I did not cry. Crying is hot and fast and useless. What I felt was colder. It was the feeling of a door closing somewhere deep inside me, locking shut forever. I was going to get my girl. And then I was going to find out exactly whose money my mother used to pay for that espresso machine. State Road 37 stretches between Indianapolis and Bloomington like a long, gray ribbon. I drove the hour south with my hands gripping the steering wheel at 10 and 2. The highway was dark, broken only by the sweeping headlights of passing trucks. My mind worked the way it does during a code blue in the trauma bay. You push the emotion to the side. You focus on the immediate threat. You stabilize the patient. Right now, the patient was my 7-year-old daughter, and the threat was the narrative my mother had spun to get her out of my house. I thought about Greg as the city limits of Bloomington appeared. We met during my first year of nursing school. I finished my degree. Greg dropped out to focus on his cover band. He is not an evil man. He is just an empty space where a father should be. He treats parenting like a dentist appointment he keeps forgetting to write on his calendar. He sends a text on birthdays and shows up at Christmas with a plastic toy bought from a gas station on the drive over. For him to suddenly take Harper on a random Tuesday meant someone had pushed a very specific button. I pulled into his apartment complex. The concrete stairs smelled like damp cardboard and old rain. I knocked on his door once using a firm, flat rhythm. Greg opened the door wearing a faded band shirt. He looked tired, rubbing the back of his neck the moment he saw me. He did not look surprised. He looked like a man caught in a trap he did not understand. I stepped past him without waiting for an invitation. The living room was dim lit only by the blue glow of a television playing a cartoon. Harper sat on a sagging futon. Her knees were pulled tight to her chest. She had her stuffed bear pressed against her face. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying. She looked up, dropped the bear, and ran across the stained carpet. I caught her in my arms and lifted her up. She buried her wet face into the collar of my scrubs. She felt small and fragile against my shoulder. I held her tight, feeling the frantic bird-like beating of her heart slow down just a fraction. I turned to face my ex-husband. "Explain this to me," I said. Greg shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Fair, your mom called me this morning. She sounded frantic. She said you were working back-to-back double shifts and that you were falling apart. She told me you were crying in the break room saying you could not handle being a mother right now. She said you needed a week to recover your mental health, and she begged me to step up." I kept my voice low so Harper would not hear the sharp edge in it. "I worked a double shift to pay the mortgage on the house she lives in. I am tired. I am not having a breakdown." I never spoke to her about my mental health, and I certainly never asked her to send my child away. Greg looked down at the floor. "Well, she made it sound like an emergency. She even sent an emergency care fund to cover groceries and gas for the week." My eyes scanned the room. On his scuffed wooden coffee table, sitting next to a half-empty energy drink and a pile of guitar picks, was a neat stack of cash. 5 crisp $100 bills. I walked over to the table, still holding Harper against my hip. I picked up the money. "This is not an emergency fund, Greg." I folded the bills in half. "This is a bribe. She paid you $500 to look the other way while they dismantled your daughter's bedroom to build a shipping center for Sloan." Greg opened his mouth, then closed it. The guilt washed over his features. He knew I was right. He had taken the money because it was easy, because believing my mother's lie required less effort than questioning it. I slipped the $500 into my scrub pocket. "Do not answer the phone the next time she calls," I told him. I turned and walked out the door, carrying my daughter down the concrete stairs and into the cool night air. Harper fell asleep in the back seat before we reached the highway. I adjusted the rearview mirror to look at her. My mother had looked at this sweet, quiet child and saw nothing but an obstacle standing in the way of Sloan's lip gloss inventory. Brenda priced my daughter's absence at exactly $500. The shock of the betrayal hardened into a cold, clinical focus. This was not a spontaneous family vote. This was a funded, calculated conspiracy to erase my child from her own home. We pulled into the Broad Ripple driveway an hour later. The house was blazing with light. I unbuckled Harper, lifted her into my arms, and carried her up the front steps. Brenda was waiting in the foyer. she had changed into a plush robe holding a mug of tea. Her eyes widened as I stepped through the door, but she quickly recovered, twisting her features into a mask of maternal exasperation. "What are you doing?" Brenda demanded, her voice shrill and echoing off the hardwood floor. "You are going to confuse the child. We made a sensible decision for everyone's well-being. You need to stop being so dramatic and think about the family." I did not stop walking. I did not blink. I did not offer her a single word of argument. I carried my sleeping daughter straight past her, ignoring the sputtering protests trailing behind me. I walked down the hall, stepped into my master bedroom, and kicked the door shut. I reached up and slid the heavy brass deadbolt into place with a loud, satisfying click. I laid Harper on my mattress and pulled the quilt over her shoulders. She stirred, asking softly if we could fix her birch trees. I smoothed the hair back from her forehead. I promised her we would paint a whole new forest, bigger and brighter than before. She closed her eyes and drifted back to sleep. I sat in the dark armchair in the corner of the room. I did not turn on the lamp. I sat in the shadows and listened. Down the hall, I could hear the muffled sound of Sloan ripping packing tape off cardboard boxes. I heard Brenda's footsteps pacing the kitchen. I waited. I stayed in that chair for 3 hours, watching the digital clock on my nightstand flip the numbers forward. I waited until the footsteps stopped, the lights clicked off, and the house fell into a deep, heavy silence. At 2 a.m, I stood up. I unlocked the deadbolt and slipped down the hallway in my socks. The floorboards were cold beneath my feet. I bypassed the kitchen and eased the front door open, stepping out into the humid Indiana night. I walked down the driveway to the mailbox by the curb. Between the double shifts and the exhaustion, I had not checked the mail in 3 days. I opened the metal hatch and pulled out a thick stack of envelopes. I stood under the amber glow of the street lamp and flipped through the pile. A grocery circular, a flyer for a local roofing company, a credit card offer, and then near the bottom of the stack, a crisp white envelope bearing the logo for Duke Energy. I stopped. I stared at the plastic address window. The address printed inside was my house in Broad Ripple, but the name printed above the street number did not belong to me. The name printed on the power bill was Brenda Rogers. A chill traced its way down my spine. I am the sole owner of this property. The utilities have been in my name since the day I signed the closing documents. You cannot simply log onto a website and swap the primary name on a utility account. Duke Energy requires verbal authorization. They require the primary account holder's social security number. My mother had picked up a telephone, dialed the power company, and pretended to be me. She impersonated my voice. She recited my social security number. She transferred the billing into her own name and set up a new account. In the ER, we are trained to spot the hidden mechanism of an injury. The bruise on the ribs is just the surface. You have to look for the punctured lung underneath. I looked at the envelope and saw the punctured lung. This was a calculated legal maneuver. In the state of Indiana, proving residency is the first step to claiming tenancy rights. You show a judge a utility bill in your name, and suddenly you are not a guest anymore. You are a legal tenant requiring a formal 30-day eviction notice. Brenda was building a paper trail to secure a permanent foothold in the house I paid for. She committed federal wire fraud over a light bill to ensure I could never simply ask her to leave. I folded the envelope and slipped it into my pocket, right next to the $500 in bribe money. I looked back at my quiet, dark house. If my mother was bold enough to commit a federal crime just to steal my electricity account, what else was she stealing? And more importantly, how was Sloan planning to afford the expensive shipping racks, the ring lights, and the merchandise she was currently unpacking in my daughter's ruined bedroom? The next morning, the sun rose over Indianapolis, and the house hummed with a terrifying, toxic normalcy. If a stranger walked through the front door, they would see a picture of domestic harmony. I left Harper sitting cross-legged on my mattress, eating a bowl of dry cereal, with her favorite cartoon playing on low volume. I kissed her forehead, told her to keep the deadbolt locked until I returned, and walked down the hallway into the lion's den. Sloane sat at the kitchen island in a matching silk pajama set. She was tapping her manicured nails against the quartz countertop, glaring at her phone screen with deep annoyance. "Fair, you really need to call the internet provider today," Sloane said. She did not even bother to look up as I entered the room. "The upload speed in this house is a joke. I cannot run a modern wellness brand on basic broadband. My followers expect high-definition video. You are bottlenecking my entire launch schedule." I poured myself a glass of tap water. "I will look into it," I said, keeping my voice as flat and featureless as a hospital bedsheet. I glanced toward the living room. My father, Tom, was already stationed in his leather recliner. The morning news played loudly. He held an empty ceramic mug, waiting for someone to offer him a refill. He did not ask about Harper. He did not ask where I had gone the night before. His superpower was an intentional, practiced ignorance. If he did not acknowledge the conflict, he did not have to take a side. My mother stood at the counter humming a soft tune. She reached out and flipped a toggle switch on the gleaming chrome machine that had replaced my humble coffee maker. The machine hissed and hissed, blowing a thick cloud of white steam into a stainless steel pitcher of milk. This was the Chekhov gun sitting right in my kitchen. The espresso machine was a heavy, dual-boiler, commercial-grade model. It looked like a piece of laboratory equipment. I work back-to-back hospital shifts and drink bitter drip coffee from a cracked glass pot. I knew exactly how much an appliance like that cost. It was an insult crafted from polished metal. Brenda poured the frothed milk into a mug and handed it to Sloane. Then she picked up a damp cloth and began wiping down the counter. "I need to grab the measuring tape from the garage," Brenda announced, tossing the cloth into the sink. "We have to finalize the dimensions for the packing tables in the new studio today." She walked past me, radiating a smug satisfaction, and stepped out the side door into the garage. Sloane took her coffee and wandered toward the living room to show Tom a video on her phone. The kitchen was finally empty. I moved instantly. I stepped over to the sink and pulled open the heavy wooden drawer that concealed the trash bin. I did not care about getting my hands dirty. I pushed aside empty yogurt containers, damp coffee grounds, and crumpled paper towels. Near the bottom, wedged against the plastic liner, I found a glossy piece of receipt paper twisted into a tight knot. I pulled it out, shook off the loose grounds, and smoothed it flat against the countertop. The logo at the top read, Williams-Sonoma. The purchase date was 2 days ago. I scanned past the store details down to the itemized lines. 1 commercial-grade espresso maker, 1 burr grinder, a set of imported ceramic tasting cups. The total printed at the bottom was $1,249. I traced my finger down to the payment method, Visa. Account ending in 4822. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt too thin to breathe. I stared at those 4 digits until they blurred. 4822. A year ago, when Tom lost his logistics business, the stress sent him to the emergency room with severe chest pains. He had let his health insurance lapse months prior. The hospital billing department handed my parents an estimate that made Brenda weep in the waiting area. I stepped in, playing the role of the dependable savior. I went online and opened a high-limit medical emergency credit card in my own name. I added my mother as an authorized user, laying down a strict rule. This card was only to be swiped for pharmacy copays, doctor visits, and life-saving necessities. I kept the physical card locked in a drawer, but Brenda had memorized the numbers for the online patient portals. I folded the receipt, slid it into the waistband of my scrub pants, and walked straight to the hall bathroom. I shut the door and locked it. I sat on the edge of the cold porcelain bathtub and pulled my phone from my pocket. My hands shook as I opened my banking application. I tapped the security icon and navigated to the external credit accounts. I found the Visa ending in 4822. The loading icon spun in a small circle. When the dashboard finally appeared on my screen, the numbers hit me like a physical strike to the chest. The total credit limit on the card was $15,000. The current balance was $14,950. Available credit, $50. I scrolled down to the transaction ledger. I felt my stomach drop as the itemized list of theft unfolded row by row. These were not hospital bills. These were not heart medications for my father. There was a charge for $2,000 at a professional photography and lighting retailer. There was an $1,800 charge to Uline for industrial shelving, shipping boxes, and bubble wrap. There were repeated, staggering charges to wholesale cosmetic distributors. There was a charge for Lululemon athletic wear. There was an $800 deposit to a local boutique catering company. Sloan was not building a business. She was building a parasite, and she had attached it directly to my financial vein. My mother had handed her my emergency credit line and told her to buy a wellness empire. They had maxed out my safety net to fund the hostile takeover of my own daughter's bedroom. The physical urge to retaliate crashed over me. I wanted to unlock the bathroom door, march into the kitchen, rip the plug out of the wall, and throw that $1,200 espresso machine through the glass patio doors. I wanted to stand in the wreckage and scream at them until my throat bled. I wanted to watch them pack their bags in terror. I gripped the edge of the bathtub until my knuckles turned white. In the emergency room, reacting to your anger is a fatal error. If a patient comes in coughing up blood, you do not panic at the sight of the red stain. You suppress the adrenaline. You work the logic tree. You find the root cause of the internal bleeding before you ever pick up a scalpel. If you just stitch the surface, the patient dies on your table. I forced myself to take a slow, deep breath, inhaling the scent of bleach and lavender soap. I looked back at the glowing screen of my phone. Sloan was preparing for a grand launch party this coming Saturday. She had catering. She had influencers coming to the house. I know how much it costs to start a physical retail operation. $15,000 buys a lot of lighting equipment and coffee machines, but it does not fund an entire commercial inventory. It does not pay for the massive bulk orders of merchandise Sloan was expecting to ship out of my house. The math did not add up. The emergency credit card was drained, but the money they were spending suggested a much deeper reservoir of cash. They were paying Greg $500 a week. They were buying custom racks. They were hosting a catered event. I locked my phone and stood up from the bathtub. I looked at my own pale reflection in the bathroom mirror. The stolen utility bill and the maxed-out credit card were just the symptoms. The infection was spreading somewhere else, hidden in a ledger I had not found yet. If Sloan's inventory had already consumed every dollar of my emergency credit, whose money were they planning to use to fund the rest of her delusional business launch? The hours following the discovery in the bathroom moved like thick molasses. I walked back into the kitchen, acting as though nothing had changed. I poured a glass of water, smiled faintly at my father, who was still glued to a morning game show, and went back to the master bedroom to check on Harper. She was drawing a picture of a forest on her sketch pad. I sat with her, focusing on the scratch of her colored pencils, trying to ignore the gnawing certainty that a much larger theft was taking place under my roof. Around 2 p.m, the house emptied out. Tom shuffled to the guest bedroom for his daily nap. Brenda drove off in her sedan to pick up floral arrangements for the upcoming launch party. Sloan announced she was heading to a local print shop to approve the label designs for her shipping boxes. The front door clicked shut. I stood in the quiet kitchen. On the center island, plugged into a white charging cable, sat Sloan's iPad. The screen was dark, but a steady stream of notification chimes pinged from its speakers. Sloan is addicted to her devices. Leaving an iPad behind meant she was either in a rush or entirely unconcerned about privacy in a house she treated as her own territory. I walked over to the island. I am not someone who pries into other people's electronics. I respect boundaries because I know what it feels like to have none. But the rules of polite society do not apply when you are sharing a roof with thieves. My survival instincts overrode my manners. I reached out and tapped the glass screen. It lit up immediately. Sloan had not bothered to set a passcode lock. The screen opened directly into a messaging application. The active window displayed an ongoing group conversation. I looked at the title bar at the top of the screen. The chat was named Atwood House. Atwood is my maiden name. It is the name I used before my brief failed marriage to Greg. It is the name my family still uses to define themselves as a collective unit. I scrolled up to view the member list. The chat included Brenda Sloan, Tom, and my 2 aunts who lived across the state in Ohio. There were 5 members. I was the only person excluded. My pulse hammered a steady rhythm against my ribs as I began to read. I scrolled back through the timeline. The messages went back 6 weeks. 6 weeks of daily planning, mocking, and coordinating. A message from Sloan dated a month ago. The lighting in the guest room is terrible. I really need the corner room for the shipping station. It has the best natural sun. A reply from Brenda followed 5 minutes later. Do not worry about the corner room. I will handle fare. We just need to wait until she pulls a heavy shift rotation. She is too tired to fight when she works doubles. We will just tell her it is a family vote. She never pushes back against the family. The words sat on the screen clear and cruel. They had studied my exhaustion. They had charted my work schedule at the hospital, waiting for the precise moment when my physical defenses would be lowest to strike at my daughter's sanctuary. I scrolled further down. The conversation shifted from interior decorating to long-term living arrangements. An aunt in Ohio chimed in, "Is Fair finally going to let you and Tom have the master bedroom? It is ridiculous that the parents are crammed into a guest space while the daughter takes the primary suite." Brenda replied immediately, "We are working on it. Once Sloan's business takes off, we are going to suggest Fair move down to the finished basement. It makes more sense. She works nights anyway, so she needs the dark, and it gives the family more room on the main floor." I felt a cold sweat break across the back of my neck. This was not just about a shipping room for lip gloss. This was a staged, methodical invasion. They were mapping out a strategy to push me into the basement, strip my daughter of her space, and claim the primary living areas for themselves. They viewed my house as an Atwood family asset, and they viewed me as the inconvenient caretaker who needed to be relocated. I pulled my phone from my pocket and began snapping photographs of the iPad screen. I documented every single message. I captured the dates, the timestamps, and the sender names. I was building a forensic file, piece by piece. I swiped down to the most recent messages sent earlier that morning. Sloan had uploaded a document to the chat. The file icon showed a red PDF symbol. The message attached to the file read, "Finally got the approval forms. Mom, make sure you print these before Saturday so we can get the final signature. The inventory distributor is breathing down my neck for the final payment." My finger hovered over the screen. I tapped the PDF icon. The document opened, filling the iPad screen with dense legal formatting. The logo at the top belonged to a major national bank. I read the bold text centered below the logo. Home Equity Line of Credit Application, HELOC. I zoomed in on the form. The property address listed was my house in Broad Ripple. The applicant name was Fair Rogers. The requested credit amount was $40,000. My breath caught in my throat. I read the numbers again to ensure I was not hallucinating. $40,000. A home equity line of credit is a loan secured against the value of your property. If you default on the payments, the bank forecloses on the house. My mother and sister were attempting to pull $40,000 of equity out of the home I spent years saving to buy. They were mortgaging my walls to pay wholesale cosmetic distributors. I scrolled to the very bottom of the final page. There, on the designated borrower line, sat my signature. It was a digital stamp, a stylized cursive font generated by a computer program, spelling out Fair Rogers. It was a forgery. They had filled out the application online, input my social security number, and digitally signed the submission page. My own mother and sister were committing felony bank fraud to fund a vanity project, confident that I would be too weak to stop them. They assumed that once the money was spent, I would simply absorb the monthly payments to protect the family from a public scandal. They thought my desire for peace was stronger than my desire for survival. I photographed the loan document, capturing the forged signature and the $40,000 sum. I closed the PDF and returned to the main screen, leaving the iPad exactly as I had found it. I stood in the kitchen, surrounded by the silence of a house that was being stolen out from under me. The utility bill and the maxed-out emergency credit card were minor infractions compared to this. A $40,000 loan against my deed was a life-altering financial attack. But as I stared at the dark screen of the iPad, a glaring logical inconsistency struck me. You cannot simply click a button on a website and receive a check for $40,000 secured by real estate. The bank requires verification. A HELOC requires an in-person property appraisal to confirm the value of the home. More importantly, it requires the borrower to physically sign the final closing documents in the presence of a licensed notary public. The bank demands a thumbprint and a physical identification check before they release the funds. Sloan and Brenda had submitted the preliminary application. They had forged the digital intent, but they could not finalize a massive property loan without me ever speaking to the bank or signing a physical contract. They needed my actual physical signature. They needed a notary. How did my mother plan to bypass the banking laws of the state of Indiana? How did she intend to force a pen into my hand to sign away my home without me noticing what I was signing? I stood in the quiet kitchen and stared at the digital glow of the tablet. The question of how they intended to secure a legal property loan without my physical presence burned in my mind. I swiped my finger down the glass screen, scrolling past the interior design complaints and the casual insults about my work schedule. I needed to find the mechanical details of the fraud. I needed the logistics. My eyes caught a block of text sent by Brenda 3 days prior. The tone of the message was starkly different from her usual smugness. It was frantic, lacking her polished confidence. I read the words, and the real plot twist hit me like a physical blow to the sternum. "Listen to me," Brenda wrote to the group. "If this loan does not clear by the 15th, my creditors are going to garnish your father's pension. They have already threatened a lien. You all need to stop worrying about paint colors and focus on getting the application pushed through. I cannot stall the collection agency another month." I read the paragraph 3 times. Creditors, garnishing a pension, a lien. A cold clarity washed over me, rearranging the entire history of my family in a matter of seconds. 3 years ago, my father sat at my dining table with his face in his hands. He told me the changing economy had ruined his logistics company. He blamed rising fuel costs and fierce corporate competition. He said the bank auctioned off his delivery trucks to cover his debts. I believed him. I opened my home to him. I took on extra shifts to feed them. The changing economy did not bankrupt Tom Rogers. My mother did. I scrolled further back, piecing together the fractured timeline from the aunt's replies. One aunt advised Brenda to stay away from the riverboat casinos down in Lawrenceburg. Another aunt mentioned the secret credit cards Brenda had opened in Tom's name to fund her compulsive shopping habits. The truth was hidden in plain sight, buried under years of domestic lies. Brenda had a secret $25,000 debt. She had bled my father's business dry from the inside out, and now her hidden creditors were circling the last remaining scrap of his retirement. Sloan's wellness brand was never a legitimate business venture. The ring lights, the lip gloss inventory, the shipping boxes. It was all a theatrical production. The boutique was a smokescreen designed to launder the home equity money. They needed a plausible reason to ask for a large sum of cash. By hiding behind the guise of a startup company, Brenda could extract the $40,000 from my property, quietly pay off her gambling and shopping debts, and throw the remaining scraps to Sloan to play store owner in my daughter's bedroom. It was a family bailout, and they planned to execute it using my house as the sacrificial lamb. But the final hurdle of the banking process still stood in their way. The bank required a notary to verify the identity of the borrower. I swiped through the chat log searching for the word notary. I found it in a message Sloan sent just yesterday. I confirmed the mobile notary Sloan wrote. He is booked for Saturday at 3 in the afternoon. Brenda replied less than a minute later. Perfect. The caterers will be setting up the appetizers. The living room will be full of people. Mrs. Gable is coming, and I invited some of those donors from the church. When the notary arrives, I will just pull Fair aside near the kitchen. I will hand her the signature pages and tell her it is routine insurance paperwork for the new home studio. An aunt responded with a laughing emoji. Will she even read it? Brenda typed back. She never reads what I give her. Besides, she hates making a scene in front of company. If I hand her a pen in a room full of wealthy guests, she will sign whatever I tell her to sign just to keep the peace. She is predictable. I lowered the tablet. The genius of their trap was sickening. They had weaponized my own psychological profile against me. For 30 years, my survival mechanism in this family was compliance. I swallowed my objections to avoid the screaming. I signed my name on their emergency medical cards to avoid the tears. I retreated into the background because being the dependable, quiet daughter was the only way to earn a fraction of peace. Brenda knew I would rather sign a stack of boring insurance updates than halt a crowded launch party to read the fine print. She planned to use the social pressure of 30 local influencers, neighbors, and church donors as a vice grip to force my hand. The catering, the music, the chatter, it was all designed to disorient me while a stranger stamped a notary seal on my financial ruin. The urge to act flared in my chest again. I wanted to print the chat logs, march into the guest room, and throw the pages onto my mother's bed. I wanted to drag them into the harsh light of accountability right this second. But my ER training held me in place. You do not cut into a patient the moment you spot the tumor. You map the vascular supply. You ensure you have the right tools to clamp the arteries, or the patient bleeds out on the table. If I confronted Brenda right now, the trap would evaporate. She would snatch the tablet from my hands and delete the chat history. She would cancel the mobile notary. She would call the bank and withdraw the online application, claiming it was just an inquiry error. Then she would dissolve into tears, call my relatives, and spin a narrative about how I invaded her privacy and falsely accused her of a crime. The evidence would vanish, the felony would remain incomplete, and they would simply wait for another opportunity to bleed me dry. I could not spring the trap prematurely. I needed them to commit to the act. I needed them to walk straight into the center of the snare they had built for me. I needed the mobile notary to arrive, the forged documents to be presented, and the audience to be watching. I had to let the launch party happen. I pressed the power button on the tablet, plunging the screen into darkness. I placed the device back onto the quartz countertop, aligning it exactly parallel to the charging cable, mirroring the precise angle I had found it in. I wiped my fingerprints off the glass with the sleeve of my scrub top. From outside the kitchen window, I heard the crunch of tires rolling over the gravel driveway. Brenda's sedan pulled up to the house. The heavy car door slammed shut. Her brisk, authoritative footsteps echoed up the front porch stairs. The enemy was returning. I had less than 10 seconds to transform myself. I could not be the forensic investigator who just uncovered a felony wire fraud ring. I could not be the angry homeowner preparing to evict her abusers. If Brenda saw even a fraction of the cold resolve crystallizing in my eyes, she would know her plan was compromised. I had to become the prey they expected. I had to become the tired, broken, compliant daughter who was ready to surrender the keys to her life. How could I play dead convincingly enough to trick the woman who had spent 30 years studying my weaknesses? The heavy front door swung open, and the distinct sound of Brenda's low heels clicked against the hardwood floor. I had mere seconds. I stepped away from the kitchen island, leaving Sloane's tablet exactly where I found it. I moved to the dining table and pulled out a chair. In the emergency room, you learn the physical mechanics of a panic attack. You see the signs every day in the waiting area. The shallow, rapid breathing, the collapse of the spinal posture, the hands pressed hard against the face to hide the trembling. I did not need to invent the exhaustion. I just needed to stop suppressing it. I let the bone-deep fatigue of a 16-hour hospital shift wash over my body. I rubbed my eyes hard with the heels of my palms until the skin felt raw and the tears pricked the corners of my vision. I slumped forward, resting my elbows on the table, and buried my face in my hands. Brenda walked into the kitchen humming a light melody, holding a bundle of expensive floral arrangements. She stopped. The humming ceased. I heard the rustle of the flowers being set down on the counter. "Fair," she said. Her tone was sharp, calculating. She was assessing the room, looking for a threat. I took a ragged, uneven breath. I let a single, pathetic sob escape my throat. It was not a loud noise. It was the quiet, defeated sound of a woman who had nothing left in the tank. I lifted my head. I made sure she saw the red, wet rims of my eyes. I let my shoulders sag toward the floor. "I am just so tired, Mom," I whispered. My voice cracked perfectly. Brenda took a step closer. The suspicion in her eyes flickered, replaced by a cautious curiosity. "Tired from what, Fair?" I looked down at the wood grain of the dining table. "I cannot keep fighting," I said, shaking my head slowly. "The double shifts, the bills, Harper. Everything feels so heavy right now. I just wanted to come home and have a quiet house. But you were right." I let the sentence hang in the air for 3 agonizing seconds. I knew what she needed to hear to drop her guard. I had to feed her ego until she choked on it. "You were right about the family vote," I continued, my voice barely audible. "I am too overwhelmed to see things clearly. If Sloan needs the room for her business, she can have the room. I will figure out where to put Harper's bed. I just do not have the energy to argue anymore." The transformation in my mother was instantaneous. The rigid tension drained from her spine. The defensive armor she wore melted away, replaced by the warm, radiant glow of a predator who had just watched its prey roll over and expose its neck. She had won. The long campaign of manipulation had finally broken her stubborn daughter. Brenda walked over to the table and pulled up a chair next to mine. She placed a cool, manicured hand over my knuckles. She squeezed my fingers, dripping with a thick, artificial sympathy. "Oh, sweetheart," Brenda cooed. She reached out and smoothed the stray lock of hair behind my ear. "We know how hard you work. We see the toll it takes on you. That is why we stepped in. The family is here to carry the burden when you cannot handle it yourself. You do not have to make all the hard choices alone anymore. We are taking care of everything." The physical touch made my stomach turn, but I leaned into it. I nodded, letting fresh tears spill onto my cheeks. "Thank you," I murmured. "I just need some peace." Right on cue, the front door opened again. Sloan breezed into the foyer, carrying a large cardboard tube of printed shipping labels. She marched into the kitchen, ready to complain about the traffic near the print shop. But she stopped when she saw the two of us sitting at the table. Brenda looked up at her younger daughter and offered a triumphant, knowing smile. "Fair and I just had a wonderful breakthrough," Brenda announced. "She realizes that the new studio space is the best decision for the household." Sloan dropped the cardboard tube onto the counter. A massive grin broke across her face. She did not ask how I was feeling. She did not apologize for sending my child away. She clapped her hands together. "That is amazing," Sloan squealed. "Because the label designs look incredible, and the supplier said the first pallet of inventory is arriving on Monday. I really need to finish prepping the walls today." Sloan did not waste another second. She spun on her heel and jogged down the hallway. A moment later, the loud ripping sound of Harper's birch forest wallpaper being torn from the drywall resumed. Brenda patted my hand one last time and stood up. "You go rest, Fair. Let us handle the details for the launch party." I retreated to my locked bedroom. I sat on the edge of my mattress, wiped the tears from my face, and listened to the sound of my family celebrating their victory. By giving them exactly what they expected, a broken, compliant workhorse, I had just bought myself 48 hours of total invisibility. To catch a thief, you do not lock the safe. You leave the vault door wide open and step into the shadows. Over the next 2 days, the atmosphere in my house shifted entirely. Because they believed I had surrendered, they stopped hiding their movements. The whispering behind closed doors ceased. They laid their weapons out on the kitchen counter for me to see. On Thursday morning, I walked past the center island and saw a yellow sticky note stuck to the marble. It had a phone number written on it, along with the name Arthur Mobile Notary, 3 p.m. Saturday. They were not even trying to conceal the trap anymore. They assumed I was too defeated to read the fine print of my own life. I leaned into my role. I became the ultimate accommodating host. When Brenda stressed over the catering menu for the launch party, I stood next to her and helped her select the appetizers. When Sloan worried that the floral arrangements were too tall for the backdrop, I carried them to the garage and trimmed the stems with pruning shears. I poured their coffee from the stolen espresso machine. I folded napkins. I nodded along to their plans. I became part of their furniture. And because furniture does not ask questions, they spoke freely in front of me. I listened as Brenda complained on the phone to an Ohio aunt about the mounting pressure from her creditors, confirming her $25,000 debt. I watched Sloan practice her influencer poses in front of the ring lights, blissfully unaware that her entire business was a hollow shell funded by a forged bank loan. The house became a pressure cooker of anticipation. The launch party was scheduled for Saturday afternoon. The guest list included local business owners, wealthy church donors, and a handful of lifestyle influencers Sloan had courted online. Brenda intended to use that crowded, loud environment to hand me a stack of fraudulent property documents. She planned to smile for the cameras while robbing me blind. Friday morning arrived. The sky over Indianapolis was thick with gray clouds. The catering company delivered stacks of folding chairs to the front porch. Sloan ran around the living room taping cords to the baseboards. Brenda stood in the center of the chaos holding a clipboard, barking orders like a field general. I walked into the kitchen wearing my blue hospital scrubs, my stethoscope draped around my neck. I poured my drip coffee into a travel mug. "Have a good shift, Fair," Brenda called out without looking up from her clipboard. "We will have everything set up by the time you get home tonight. Make sure you get some rest. Tomorrow is a big day for the family." "It certainly is," I replied. I walked out the front door and got into my car. I drove toward the downtown medical district, but my mind was not on patient charts or medication schedules. Friday was my last window of opportunity. The trap was set for Saturday at 3 o'clock. My mother had her fake insurance papers, her mobile notary, and her audience of local elites ready to apply the social pressure. They spent their Friday finalizing their appetizers and their lighting angles. They thought I was spending my Friday checking vital signs and changing IV bags. But a hospital shift includes a mandatory lunch hour, and as I parked my car in the employee parking structure, I looked at the clock on my dashboard. I had exactly 60 minutes to secure the legal weapons I needed to turn my mother's launch party into an execution. While they arranged their fake inventory, what was I doing on my lunch break at the hospital? The hospital cafeteria smelled like institutional bleach and burnt soup. I bypassed the double doors entirely. At noon, I pushed through the heavy glass exit and walked out into the employee parking structure. The Indiana sky hung low, threatening rain, trapping the summer humidity against the concrete pillars. I unlocked my sedan, climbed into the driver's seat, and shut the door, sealing myself inside the quiet cabin. I had exactly 60 minutes before my pager summoned me back to the trauma bay, and I needed every second to build my arsenal. I scrolled through my phone contacts and pressed the call button for Patricia Vance. 2 years ago, a prominent local real estate attorney was rushed into my ER with a severe laceration from a boating accident. I held pressure on her husband's arm, kept her updated on his vitals, and managed the clinical chaos while the surgical team prepped the suite. Patricia handed me her embossed card in the waiting room, telling me to call if I ever needed a legal shark. I needed a shark today. She answered on the second ring, her voice crisp and alert. "Patricia," I said, leaning my head back against the headrest, "I need to retain your services right now. I have an active domestic fraud situation, and I need to remove 3 adults from my property by tomorrow afternoon. Tell me the symptoms." "Fair," Patricia replied, shifting instantly into a professional gear. I rattled off the clinical details of the betrayal, keeping my tone devoid of emotion. I explained the Duke Energy utility bill, detailing the federal wire fraud Brenda committed by impersonating my voice over the telephone. I listed the drained emergency medical credit card and the thousands of dollars funneled into cosmetic inventory. Finally, I delivered the fatal blow. I described the $40,000 home equity line of credit application, the forged digital signature, and the mobile notary Brenda scheduled to finalize the theft during a crowded Saturday party. The phone line went silent for a few seconds. I heard the rhythmic scratching of a fountain pen on paper. "Your mother is ambitious," Patricia noted. "Most house guests just steal the good towels. Are they attempting to claim legal tenancy based on the stolen utility bill?" "Yes," I said. "Brenda thinks it forces me into a standard 30-day eviction process. She thinks she has a full month to fight me in civil court while living under my roof." Patricia let out a sharp, genuine laugh. "A 30-day notice is for a tenant who forgets to pay rent. It is not for a tenant who commits felony identity theft and bank fraud. Under Indiana property law, engaging in illegal activity on the premises accelerates the timeline to 0. I am drafting a 3-day notice to quit. It is an immediate, non-negotiable demand to vacate due to criminal acts. Once I stamp this document, they have no legal right to remain on your property." She promised to email the drafted notices within the hour. I ended the call and dialed the fraud department of the bank listed on the HELOC application. I provided my Social Security number, proved my identity using my tax records, and placed a hard freeze on the loan processing. I requested a direct confirmation code. The bank agent read a 9-digit fraud case number over the line. I wrote it down on the back of a hospital parking receipt. The $40,000 was locked away behind a federal firewall far beyond Brenda's reach. I started the engine and drove out of the parking structure. I navigated the busy downtown Indianapolis streets until I found a local print shop tucked between a pharmacy and a coffee stand. I walked inside. The air conditioning hummed loudly, carrying the distinct scent of hot toner and fresh paper. I stepped up to the self-service computer terminal. I logged into my secure cloud storage and accessed the high-resolution photographs I had taken of Sloane's tablet. I hit the print command. The heavy commercial machine whirred to life, spitting out crisp, full-color images of the Atwood House group chat. The time-stamped evidence of their conspiracy slid into the output tray. Next, I printed the official property deed, displaying my sole ownership in stark black ink. Then I opened my email and printed the formal 3-day notices to quit Patricia had just sent over. I walked over to the office supply aisle. I bypassed the flimsy plastic sleeves and selected a heavy, professional-grade manila folder. It felt substantial in my hands, rigid and unyielding. I stood at the laminate counter and loaded my weapons. The property deed went in first, forming the foundation. Next went the piece of paper bearing the 9-digit bank fraud confirmation code. The printed text messages highlighting Brenda's secret $25,000 debt and their calculated plans to trick me with the notary went in third. Finally, I slid the 3 formal eviction notices into the back. I folded the brass clasps flat, sealing the documents securely inside. This was no longer a collection of paper. It was a tactical strike waiting to be launched. I walked back to my car. I had one final phone call to make before my lunch hour expired. I dialed the non-emergency dispatch line for the Marion County Sheriff. A dispatcher answered, her voice carrying a bored, practiced monotone. "I am the sole homeowner at an address in Broad Ripple," I stated, reading my street number aloud for the recording. "I will be serving immediate eviction notices tomorrow afternoon to family members involved in an active identity theft investigation. The individuals have a history of volatile, escalating behavior when confronted. I am requesting a civil standby tomorrow at 4 o'clock. The dispatcher typed on her mechanical keyboard. "We can send a cruiser to monitor the perimeter and keep the peace," she confirmed. "A deputy will be parked outside your residence at 4 o'clock. The snare was fully built. I drove back to the hospital, finished my afternoon shift, and returned home. The house smelled like catered appetizers and fresh chemical paint. Brenda stood in the kitchen directing Sloane on where to place the folding chairs for the influencers. They ignored me as I walked past them, assuming I was still the broken workhorse. I slipped down the hallway and entered my master bedroom. Harper sat on the floor brushing the fur of her stuffed bear. I locked the door behind me. I knelt beside her and opened a small paper bag I had brought from my car. Inside was a tiny tin of luminescent paint and a fine-tipped brush. Harper's eyes widened. She stood up, grabbed my hand, and we tiptoed into the adjoining bathroom, which shared a connected door with her ruined bedroom. We slipped inside the empty space. The room was dark, the air thick with the smell of Sloane's expensive wall primer. The beautiful birch forest we had created together was gone, replaced by a sterile, lifeless gray. I set up a step stool near the window. I climbed up, dipped the brush into the paint, and pressed the bristles against the ceiling. I painted one single, perfect, 5-pointed star. I stepped down and turned off the overhead light. The tiny star glowed faint and steady against the encroaching gray void. Harper stared up at it, her small hand gripping my fingers. "It is just one," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "It is a start," I replied, crouching down to her eye level. "I promise you, Harper, the whole sky is coming back." I tucked her into my bed and walked over to my wooden dresser. I laid the heavy manila folder on the polished surface. I reached up and unclipped my RN badge from my scrub collar. I set the plastic identification card directly on top of the folder. I wanted to wear it tomorrow. I wanted to walk into that crowded living room not as the compliant daughter they invented, but as the trauma nurse who stops the bleeding. The Saturday launch party was mere hours away. Brenda was preparing to hand me a forged contract in a room filled with local influencers, wealthy donors, and watching neighbors. When the house filled with their affluent friends, how would I drop the match into the gasoline? Saturday afternoon blanketed Indianapolis in a humid, oppressive heat. Inside my house in Broad Ripple, the air conditioning struggled to keep up with the sheer volume of warm bodies. By 2 o'clock, the living room was packed shoulder to shoulder. The air was thick with the scent of expensive catered hors d'oeuvres, heavy floral perfumes, and the sharp tang of cheap champagne. Sloane had spared no expense in curating her audience. She invited 3 local wellness influencers whose manicured social media feeds commanded thousands of followers. A handful of boutique investors stood near the fireplace, sipping their drinks and nodding at Sloane's business pitch. Brenda had stacked the remaining guest list with her own affluent network. I recognized several wealthy donors from her suburban churchwomen, draped in cashmere, who believed Brenda was a paragon of domestic grace. Even Mrs. Gable, the nosy affluent neighbor from 3 doors down, stood near the foyer holding a beautifully wrapped housewarming gift. Sloane's towering circular ring lights bathed the living room in a harsh, sterile glow, erasing the shadows and casting an artificial spotlight on the center of the floor. My furniture had been pushed against the walls to make room for high-top cocktail tables. The home I had carefully purchased and decorated felt like a rented convention hall. Harper stood pressed against my right leg, her small fingers gripping the fabric of my dark jeans. She held her stuffed bear tightly against her chest, her eyes wide as she watched the loud, unfamiliar adults drink and laugh in her living room. I looked down and stroked her hair, offering a reassuring squeeze to her shoulder. I wore a simple black blouse, but clipped to the collar, sitting squarely against my chest, was my hospital identification badge, Fair Rogers, registered nurse. I held the heavy manila folder tucked securely under my left arm, pressed flat against my ribs. Sloane drifted through the crowd in a tailored cream suit, pointing to the hallway and loudly explaining her grand vision for the new shipping studio. She gestured toward Harper's ruined bedroom with an air of profound importance. I really needed a dedicated space with natural light to handle the fulfillment logistics, Sloane told a group of investors, swirling the champagne in her glass. You cannot scale a modern wellness brand out of a basement. The family agreed it was time to optimize the floor plan. One of the wellness influencers, a woman holding a professional camera gimbal, nodded in vigorous agreement. That is so vital for your workflow, she cooed, lifting her lens to capture a candid video of Sloane laughing. I love that your family is so supportive of your launch. Brenda materialized from the kitchen, playing the role of the ultimate benevolent matriarch. She wore a tailored blazer and a radiant, polished smile. She moved gracefully between the cocktail tables, greeting the church donors, accepting compliments on the catering, and projecting an aura of total control. She was in her element. She thrived on an audience. She believed the social pressure of these wealthy, connected guests formed an impenetrable shield around her. As Brenda approached the center of the living room, her eyes darted toward the front window, checking the street outside. She was waiting for the mobile notary to arrive. She was waiting for the final piece of the $40,000 puzzle to walk through the door so she could hand me the forged contract. She caught my gaze. Her smile tightened, just a fraction, a microscopic command warning me to stay in my place. She expected me to retreat into the kitchen, to shrink into the drywall and wash the dirty catering plates while she stole my equity in the next room. She expected the broken, compliant workhorse she had conditioned for 30 years. I did not break eye contact. I did not shrink. Brenda turned away from me and raised her glass high into the air. She picked up a silver spoon from a nearby cocktail table and tapped it against the crystal rim. The sharp, ringing sound cut through the ambient chatter. The conversations died down. The influencers lowered their cameras. The investors turned their attention to the center of the room. "I want to propose a toast," Brenda announced, her voice projecting with practiced theatricality. She reached out and placed a maternal hand firmly on Sloane's shoulder. Sloane beamed, leaning into the touch. "We are so incredibly grateful to have all of you here today," Brenda continued, sweeping her gaze across the attentive crowd. "Today marks the beginning of an exciting new chapter. To new beginnings, to my brilliant daughter's wellness business, and to our family's beautiful new home." The crowd erupted into polite applause. The influencers raised their glasses. Mrs. Gable clapped enthusiastically from the foyer. Brenda drank from her glass, her eyes sparkling with absolute triumph. The velvet trap had sprung. The audience was captive. The stage was perfectly set for the notary to arrive and the papers to be signed. I stepped away from the wall. I moved deliberately, my dark shoes silent against the hardwood floor. Harper stayed glued to my side, matching my slow, measured pace. I walked directly into the center of the living room, stopping mere feet away from Brenda and Sloane. I stood directly beneath the harsh, blinding glare of the ring lights. I raised my own glass of cheap champagne. I did not raise it high. I held it at chest level, close to my hospital badge. I smiled pleasantly. It was the same calm, unreadable smile I use when walking into a chaotic trauma bay. "I would love to say a few words," I said. My voice was not loud. I did not shout over the crowd. I spoke in my standard indoor clinical register. But the tone was so jarringly steady, so devoid of the expected celebratory warmth that it acted like a sudden drop in barometric pressure. The room went completely still. The clinking of glasses ceased. The influencers paused their professional smiles, faltering as they sensed the sudden shift in the atmosphere. Brenda's eyes narrowed. A flash of genuine panic crossed her features. She tried to maintain her matriarchal facade, letting out a tight, forced chuckle. "Oh, fair sweetheart," Brenda said quickly, taking a step toward me to intercept. "There is no need for another speech. Let the guests enjoy the catering." I did not retreat. I held my ground, the manila folder pressed firmly under my arm. "I think a second toast is appropriate, Mom," I replied, locking my gaze onto hers. "Specifically, I think your guests would love to hear about how this beautiful family home was acquired and exactly how Sloane's brilliant new business was funded." The silence in the living room thickened into something heavy and suffocating. The investors exchanged confused, cautious glances. Mrs. Gable lowered her hands to the wrapped gift, suddenly looking awkward in her grasp. The influencers looked back and forth between me and my mother, recognizing that the polished narrative they had been fed was rapidly fracturing. Brenda's chest rose and fell in a sharp, shallow breath. The velvet trap was supposed to close around me. She never anticipated that I would step inside it, lock the door, and turn the weapons on her. Would the wealthy donors and the local influencers realize they had just walked onto the set of an active felony crime scene? I kept my vocal tone anchored in the flat, clinical register I utilize when delivering a grim medical prognosis. The living room held its collective breath. 30 pairs of eyes bounced between the two women, standing under the harsh glare of the photographic lights. Brenda remained rigid. Her manicured fingers gripped the stem of her champagne flute so tightly, the skin across her knuckles stretched white, highlighting the tension humming through her frame. "Brenda," I asked, intentionally stripping away the maternal title she used as a protective shield, "why do you not share the specific details of the recent family vote with your guests, since we are gathered here celebrating new beginnings?" "The origin story of this shipping studio seems highly relevant to your investors." A high, brittle chuckle escaped my mother's throat. She waved her free hand, a fluttering, dismissive gesture, engineered to signal to the watching crowd that this was merely a trivial domestic misunderstanding. "Oh, fair," she said, her smile stretching painfully thin across her teeth. "We do not need to burden our wonderful guests with the tedious logistics of household planning. Let us just enjoy the beautiful catering and the music." I did not shift my weight. I anchored my stance to the hardwood floor, my right hand resting gently on Harper's small shoulder. The child leaned into my leg, sensing the tectonic shift in the room's power dynamic. "You voted to convert my 7-year-old daughter's bedroom into a retail packing facility," I stated. I stripped all emotion from the sentence, presenting the cruel reality like a laboratory test result. "Tell the room how that voting process worked." The church donors congregating near the brick fireplace exchanged uneasy, darting glances. The polished narrative was fracturing, exposing the ugly foundation beneath the expensive floral arrangements. Brenda felt her captive audience slipping away. Her ego, the central engine driving her entire existence, could not tolerate a public challenge. She could not appear weak or subordinate in front of the affluent women she desperately sought to impress. She lifted her chin, adopting the familiar, imperious posture she relied on to dominate her husband and her younger daughter. "Yes, we took a family vote," Brenda announced. Her voice gained volume, grasping for a tone of righteous authority. "We are a close-knit unit. We make decisions together for the greater good of everyone living under this roof. That is how a functional household operates." I nodded, slowly absorbing her public confession. She had claimed ownership of the theft in front of 3 dozen witnesses. She laid her own trap, and I was prepared to drop the anvil. I reached across my torso and unclasped the brass tabs of the heavy manila folder tucked beneath my left arm. The metal bent backward with a soft scraping sound. I slid my fingers inside and extracted the first crisp sheet of paper. I did not wave the document around. I held it up steadily, keeping the black ink facing the silent crowd. "This is the property deed to this house," I announced. The words hung suspended in the sterile illumination of the ring lights. "It is officially recorded at the county assessor's office. If anyone would like to examine the legal description or the parcel number, I am happy to pass it around the room." I lowered the paper a few inches, locking my eyes onto my mother's pale, rigid face. "There is exactly one name printed on this deed," I said. "Fair Rogers. You can vote on what to prepare for dinner, Mom. You can vote on what television program to watch in the living room. You cannot vote to overwrite property law." The atmosphere in the living room morphed from awkward tension into visceral discomfort. The guests suddenly realized they were not attending an exclusive business launch. They were standing inside a stolen residence, sipping champagne paid for by an insurgent force. Mrs. Gable, the neighbor who prided herself on knowing every neighborhood secret, slowly set her crystal glass down on a nearby side table. She took a distinct, deliberate step backward, distancing herself physically from Brenda. A prominent boutique investor, standing near the hallway arch, cleared his throat and checked his wristwatch, suddenly eager to be anywhere else. The lifestyle influencers, women who carefully curated every aspect of their public image, began lowering their phone cameras, unwilling to record their association with a domestic hostile takeover. I glanced past the crowd toward the living room perimeter. My father remained seated in his worn leather recliner. He stared down at the carpet, his jaw slack, refusing to intervene or meet my gaze. He watched his wife's manufactured kingdom catch fire and chose his familiar, cowardly silence over defending his own child. Brenda opened her mouth to speak, but the words failed to materialize in her throat. The deed in my hand was an immovable object. It did not care about her maternal authority. It did not respond to guilt trips, tears, or manipulation. It was a legal reality she could not argue away. Sloan, however, lacked her mother's tactical restraint. Watching her carefully curated influencer audience recoil, my sister panicked. Her expensive cream suit suddenly looked less like professional business attire and more like a child's dress-up costume. She stepped forward, the skin of her neck and chest flushing a deep, angry crimson. "It is family money," Fair Sloan yelled, her voice cracking with raw desperation. She gestured wildly toward the tall ring lights and the sprawling catering spread. "You are embarrassing us in front of my investors. We share resources. That is what a family does. You are just being selfish because you are jealous of my brand." Harper flinched at the sudden shouting, burying her face into my hip. I tightened my grip on her shoulder, offering a silent promise of safety. I turned my head and studied my younger sister. She stood trembling, clinging desperately to the delusion that she was a rising entrepreneur rather than a thief playing store owner in a fantasy funded by my stolen credit line. Sloan wanted to talk about resources. She wanted to yell about shared funds and financial support in front of the very people she hoped would write her a startup check. She threw the door wide open, inviting the exact financial execution she feared most. I lowered the deed and slid it neatly back into the folder. My facial expression remained locked in that cold, clinical neutrality. If Sloan wanted to discuss the family money, it was time to reveal the true cost of this catered party. It was time to pull the curtain back on the $25,000 hidden gambling debt, the drained medical cards, and the forged digital signature currently sitting in a federal banking queue. If these local influencers and wealthy church donors wanted to invest their capital in Sloan's wellness brand, they deserved to know exactly who they were getting into business with. Sloan's desperate accusation about family money hung in the stagnant air of the living room. Before I could respond, the sharp electronic chime of the front doorbell echoed down the hallway. The sound shattered the heavy silence. Brenda jumped, her eyes darting toward the foyer. A look of frantic relief washed over her pale face. The cavalry had arrived. The final piece of her $40,000 puzzle was standing on the porch. She needed that signature, and she needed the distraction of a new arrival to pivot the attention away from the property deed. Brenda took a hurried step toward the entryway. "I will get that," she announced, her voice pitching up an octave, attempting to inject a false, breezy enthusiasm back into the room. "It is likely just a late delivery for the catering spread. Everyone, please continue enjoying yourselves." I did not let her pass. I stepped sideways, physically blocking her path to the hallway. "I will answer my own front door, Mom," I said. Brenda's jaw tightened. She reached out her manicured fingers, brushing my arm, an aggressive grab disguised as a maternal touch. "Fair, do not be rude to our guests. I can handle a simple delivery." I ignored her. I turned my back on the silent watching crowd and walked down the short hallway to the entryway. I pulled open the heavy wooden door. Standing on my porch was a man in his late 50s. He wore a crisp blue button-down shirt tucked into dark slacks. A plastic identification badge hung from a lanyard around his neck, displaying a state seal. He held a thick, leather-bound clipboard pressed against his chest, clutching a silver pen. He looked past my shoulder, sensing the thick, uncomfortable tension radiating from the packed living room. "Hi," the man said, offering a practiced, professional smile. "I am looking for Fair Rogers. I am the mobile notary commissioned by the bank to finalize the home equity line of credit documents. I was told to arrive at 3 o'clock to execute the signatures." I did not lower my voice. I did not attempt to shield the conversation from the listening audience gathered a few feet away. I pitched my response so the words carried clearly down the hallway and directly into the center of the ring lights. "Are you here for the $40,000 HELOC application?" I asked, enunciating each syllable with precise, surgical clarity. The man nodded, pulling a thick stack of printed contracts from under the metal clip of his board. "Yes, ma'am. I just need to verify your primary identification, complete a brief visual appraisal of the property condition, and obtain your physical signature on the closing disclosures." I reached into the manila folder still tucked under my arm. I extracted the single sheet of paper displaying the 9-digit confirmation code I had written down in the hospital parking structure. I held it out, presenting the numbers to the notary. "I am Fair Rogers," I stated. "I am the sole legal owner of this property. I did not authorize a $40,000 loan against my equity. The digital signature submitted on that preliminary bank application was forged by the women currently standing in my living room." The professional smile vanished from the notary's face, replaced by a look of profound legal terror. He stared at the 9-digit code written on the paper. "The bank fraud department is already actively involved," I continued, maintaining my level, clinical tone. "The processing account is frozen under a federal security hold. If you cross this threshold and attempt to execute those documents, you will be participating in an active felony identity theft investigation. I strongly advise you to return to your vehicle and report this incident to your dispatch office. You need to leave my property right now." The notary did not argue. He did not ask for clarification. He understood the severe legal liability of his profession. His eyes widened, darting nervously between me and the silent crowd visible through the hallway arch. He took a rapid, clumsy step backward, nearly tripping over the edge of the welcome mat. "Understood, ma'am," he stammered, shoving the paperwork back onto his clipboard. "I am logging this as a fraudulent dispatch. Have a good afternoon." He turned and practically sprinted down the concrete steps. I stood in the doorway and watched him march to his sedan, throw his equipment into the passenger seat, and peel out of the driveway. I closed the heavy wooden door until the latch clicked. I turned around and walked slowly back down the hallway, stepping back into the glare of Sloane's artificial lighting. The living room had transformed into a mausoleum. The guests were frozen in place, processing the brutal, undeniable exchange they had just overheard. The polished facade of the Atwood family was entirely dismantled. I looked directly at the boutique investors congregating near the brick fireplace. They were the men and women Sloane had spent weeks courting, begging for capital to fund her shipping operation. "Sloane's new wellness boutique is not funded by a legitimate business loan," I stated, ensuring my voice reached the farthest corners of the room. "It is funded by felony identity theft, federal wire fraud, and emergency medical credit cards stolen from my locked desk drawer." The reaction was immediate and devastating. One of the major local wellness influencers, a woman wearing a tailored linen jumpsuit, pulled her smartphone from her pocket with trembling hands. I watched her frantically tap the screen, hastily deleting the promotional video stories she had posted, tagging Sloane's brand just 20 minutes prior. She wanted no digital connection to a criminal enterprise. An older investor, a man who had previously nodded along to Sloane's business pitch, set his champagne flute down on a cocktail table with a sharp, dismissive clatter. He looked at my younger sister with a mixture of profound disgust and pity. He crossed his arms over his chest, physically closing himself off from her pitch. Sloane crumbled under the weight of their judgment. The color drained completely from her face. She looked down at her expensive cream suit, suddenly realizing she was wearing the proceeds of a crime. She opened her mouth trying to formulate a defense, but only a pathetic, breathless sob emerged. She stepped backward, retreating away from her shrinking audience, her entire future evaporating in real time. Brenda, however, refused to surrender. Her ego was a cornered animal lashing out blindly to survive the execution. "She is lying!" Brenda shrieked. The sudden, high-pitched scream shattered the quiet, causing several guests to flinch. Brenda pointed a shaking finger at my chest. Her perfectly styled hair fell out of place, her face contorting into an ugly, desperate snarl. "Do not listen to a word she says. She is unstable. She works herself into a state of pure delusion. She is an unfit mother who cannot even handle her own child. I stepped in to save this family because she is falling apart. She is trying to ruin her sister out of pure, bitter jealousy." Brenda's false accusations echoed off the walls. She wielded the ultimate weapon of the toxic matriarch, painting herself as the selfless savior, protecting an innocent child from a deranged parent. It was a powerful emotional lie designed to introduce a sliver of doubt into the minds of the observing church donors. I stood perfectly still, my hand resting protectively on Harper's shoulder. I did not raise my voice to match her screaming. I did not engage in a shouting match. I knew that arguing with a cornered narcissist only validates their manufactured drama. I needed an undeniable truth. I needed a weapon that could not be shouted down, manipulated, or twisted by maternal tears. I reached back into the heavy manila folder. How could I prove to this room of affluent watching strangers that Brenda was not a savior, but a thief, attempting to launder her own secret debts through the sacrifice of my daughter's sanctuary? Brenda's desperate accusations hovered in the humid air of the living room. She stood, panting, her chest heaving under her tailored blazer, waiting for her performance to take root in the minds of her affluent guests. She expected the church donors to rally to her defense. She expected the local influencers to view me as the unstable villain in her fabricated domestic tragedy. I did not offer a rebuttal to her lies. Defending yourself against a manufactured reality only gives the illusion that a debate exists. I bypassed her entirely. I slid my hand into the heavy manila folder one final time. I bypassed the official property deed and the eviction notices. My fingers closed around a thick stack of glossy printer paper. I pulled the pages out and held them flat. They were the high-resolution photographs I had taken of Sloane's unguarded tablet. I looked at the boutique investors and the neighborhood gossips gathered around my cocktail tables. My mother just called me an unfit parent, I stated, keeping my voice anchored in a calm, steady rhythm. She claims she stepped in to save this household because I am falling apart. I think it is only fair that you hear her own words on the subject. I held up the first printed screenshot. The bright blue and gray messaging bubbles were clearly visible to anyone standing within 10 feet. This is a transcript from a private group chat titled Atwood House, I Explained. It includes my mother, my sister, my father, and 2 extended relatives. I am the only person excluded. These messages were sent over the past 6 weeks. Let us begin with the events of this past Tuesday, the day my 7-year-old daughter suddenly disappeared from my home. I looked down at the glossy paper and began to read aloud. I did not inject any dramatic flair into my delivery. The raw text provided all the necessary devastation. A message from Brenda sent Tuesday at 8 in the morning, I read, projecting my voice so every syllable reached the back corners of the room. I quote, I just wired Greg $500 from the emergency fund. He is picking Harper up from school today. He thinks Fair is having a mental breakdown. We finally have the kid out of the way for the week. Sloane, you can start tearing down that awful wallpaper in the corner bedroom today. A collective, audible intake of breath swept through the gathered crowd. The church donors' women who had praised Brenda for her boundless maternal grace just moments prior stared at her with wide, horrified eyes. Paying a deadbeat ex-husband to remove a child from her own home was not the action of a savior. It was the calculated cruelty of an invader. I did not give them time to recover. I flipped to the second printed page. Perhaps we should discuss the home equity line of credit, I continued. The $40,000 required to fund this shipping studio. I read the next exchange, highlighting the dates and timestamps. A message from Sloane sent yesterday afternoon. I confirmed the mobile notary. He is booked for Saturday at 3. I paused, letting the timeline sink into the minds of the guests. The notary had just sprinted off my front porch. The reality of the trap was crystallizing in real time. A reply from Brenda I read, maintaining my unyielding tone. Perfect. The living room will be full of people. Mrs. Gable is coming. I will hand Fair the signature pages and tell her it is routine insurance paperwork. She never reads what I give her. If I hand her a pen in a room full of wealthy guests, she will sign whatever I tell her to sign, just to keep the peace. She is predictable. I lowered the paper. The local lifestyle influencers, women who guarded their reputations with ruthless precision, suddenly realized the true nature of their invitations. Sloane had not invited them here to celebrate a business launch. They were summoned to act as human props. Brenda and Sloane needed a crowded, distracting environment to exert social pressure. The guests were unwitting accomplices in a plot to trick a trauma nurse into signing away her financial independence. A wave of profound revulsion rippled through the audience. An influencer wearing a silk blouse physically recoiled from Sloan, bumping into a cocktail table in her haste to retreat. The boutique investors recognized the fatal liability standing in front of them. Funding a startup company carries inherent risk, but financing a shell corporation built on forged signatures and stolen property equity guarantees an immediate subpoena. But the final revelation still waited in my hand. I flipped to the third page. I looked directly at Sloan, whose face had gone slack with terror. "If anyone here is still considering writing a check to fund this wellness brand," I said, "you need to understand where your capital is actually going." I looked down and read the fatal text. "A message from Brenda sent 3 days ago," I recited. "Listen to me. If this loan does not clear by the 15th, my creditors are going to garnish your father's pension. They have already threatened a lien. You all need to stop worrying about paint colors and focus on getting the application pushed through. I cannot stall the collection agency another month." I dropped the pages onto the nearest cocktail table. The glossy sheets fanned out next to a tray of untouched hors d'oeuvres. "My father did not lose his logistics company to a changing economy," I told the silent, judging crowd. "He lost it to a $25,000 secret gambling and shopping debt generated by his wife." Sloan's boutique is not a real business. It is a money laundering smokescreen. They needed a legitimate reason to extract $40,000 from my property. They planned to pay off my mother's hidden creditors and let Sloan play store owner with whatever change was left over. The polished, invincible mask of the Atwood matriarch shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Brenda stood frozen, stripped of her lies, her fake tears, and her stolen authority. The devastating truth hung in the air, undeniable and lethal. The social execution demanded a catalyst to break the paralysis. Mrs. Gable provided it. The affluent neighbor did not say a single word. She simply pressed her lips into a thin white line of supreme disgust. She marched forward, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She walked directly to the gift table set up near the entryway. She reached out, grabbed the expensive silver-wrapped housewarming present she had brought to celebrate the fake business, and tucked it firmly under her arm. She turned on her heel and walked out the front door, leaving it standing wide open behind her. Her departure broke the dam. The living room descended into a chaotic, desperate exodus. The boutique investors did not bother offering excuses. They grabbed their briefcases and hurried toward the exit, eager to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the impending fraud investigation. The lifestyle influencers snatched their expensive handbags from the coat rack, fleeing down the front porch steps as though the house itself was collapsing. Even the hired catering staff stopped circulating their silver trays, retreating to the kitchen to pack their equipment in awkward, hurried silence. Within 3 minutes, the sprawling audience evaporated. Sloan could not withstand the evaporation of her fantasy. The reality of her ruined reputation crushed her legs. She dropped to her knees right there in the center of the living room, her tailored cream suit wrinkled against the floorboards. She surrounded herself with useless cardboard shipping boxes and expensive ring lights she could no longer afford to turn on. She buried her face in her hands and began sobbing hysterically, mourning the death of a brand that never truly existed. Brenda was left standing in a void. Her admiring church donors had vanished. Her affluent network was gone. She was the queen of an empty, silent room. She opened her mouth, unleashing a series of ragged, echoing shrieks. The sounds were guttural, devoid of any words, just the raw, animalistic noise of a narcissist watching their mirror shatter into dust. I stood perfectly still amidst their emotional wreckage. My breathing was slow and even. I kept my hand resting on Harper's shoulder, shielding her from the chaotic noise of her grandmother's collapse. I felt the profound physical lightness of 30 years of manipulation lifting from my spine. The social execution was a total success. Their reputations were permanently dismantled in the Indianapolis community. But exposing a parasite does not cure the infection. You still have to extract the roots. I held the property deed, and they were still standing on my hardwood floors. How would I physically remove these 3 toxic adults from my home before the sun went down? The front door stood ajar, letting the humid Indiana air seep into the sudden, echoing emptiness of the living room. The caterers had vanished out the back entrance, leaving behind half-empty trays of expensive appetizers and a stack of unpaid invoices on the kitchen island. Sloane remained crumpled on the hardwood floor, her hysterical sobbing echoing off the walls, a pathetic soundtrack to the collapse of her fake wellness empire. Brenda stopped shrieking. The chaotic, animalistic noise abruptly ceased as her survival instincts rebooted. The audience was gone, which meant the performance was over. She wiped a streak of ruined mascara from her cheek with the back of a trembling hand. She turned to face me. The polished matriarch was dead, replaced by something feral and cornered. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, venomous rage. "You little brat," Brenda hissed. The words scraped against her throat, laced with decades of toxic entitlement. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at my chest. "You think you have won because you printed out some text messages? You think a piece of paper means anything in the real world?" She took a menacing step forward, attempting to physically intimidate me, relying on the old power dynamics that governed my childhood. "We are not leaving," she declared, her voice rising to a dangerous pitch. "You cannot force us out. I know my rights. If you try to evict us, I will drag you through the civil courts for years. I will bleed your bank accounts dry with legal fees. You will lose this house trying to fight me. I am your mother, and I will not be thrown into the street like garbage." I did not flinch. I did not take a step backward. Her threats were loud, violent, and entirely predictable. A narcissist stripped of their social armor always resorts to the threat of drawn-out attrition. They assume their target lacks the endurance for a protracted war. I did not intend to fight a protracted war. I had built a guillotine. I ignored her pointing finger. I placed a gentle hand on Harper's back, guiding her slightly behind me, shielding her from the brunt of Brenda's fury. I walked calmly past my mother, crossing the living room, toward the large bay window that looked out onto the quiet Broad Ripple Street. I reached out and pulled back the heavy fabric curtain. Parked at the very edge of my gravel driveway, positioned squarely in front of the house, was a white and blue Marion County Sheriff's Cruiser. The vehicle was idling. The red and blue light bar mounted on the roof was activated, flashing silently in a steady, rhythmic pulse that reflected off the window panes and danced across the walls of my living room. I turned back to face my family. Brenda had followed my gaze out the window. The color drained from her face a second time, leaving her complexion the shade of old ash. The furious confidence she projected just seconds ago evaporated into a hollow, breathless terror. I reached into the manila folder one final time. I pulled out the 3 distinct, personalized documents drafted by Patricia Vance. I walked over to the nearest cocktail table, brushing aside a forgotten champagne flute, and dropped the papers flat onto the surface. "These are formal 3-day notices to quit," I explained, keeping my tone devoid of emotion. "They are legally drafted eviction notices, accelerating your removal timeline to 0 due to documented illegal activity occurring on the premises." I tapped the stack of papers with my index finger. "But I am not waiting 3 days. I am giving you a one-time, non-negotiable offer." I looked down at Sloane, who had stopped sobbing and was now staring at the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the living room walls. I looked at Brenda, who stood frozen, her eyes locked on the police cruiser parked mere yards away. "You have exactly 3 hours," I stated. "You have 3 hours to go into those bedrooms, pack whatever items you can fit into the trunks of your cars, and drive away from this property. You will leave the keys on the kitchen counter. You will not take any fixtures, appliances, or furniture." Brenda opened her mouth, a weak protest forming on her lips, but I cut her off instantly. "If either of you are still standing inside my house at 4 o'clock this afternoon," I continued, my voice dropping to a hard, deadly whisper, "I will walk out the front door. I will hand that uniformed deputy this manila folder. It contains undeniable, time-stamped proof of felony wire fraud, identity theft, and forged banking applications. You will not face a civil court battle over tenancy rights. You will both be placed in handcuffs, loaded into the back of that cruiser, and booked into the county jail before the sun goes down. The silence in the room was absolute. The reality of the flashing lights broke them completely. Brenda and Sloan realized they had reached the end of their operational runway. They could manipulate a family member. They could gaslight a checked-out ex-husband. They could spin a false narrative to a room full of gullible church donors. But they could not gaslight a badge. They could not cry their way out of a documented felony investigation. The legal threat was real, immediate, and parked in the driveway. I looked past my mother and sister, scanning the perimeter of the room. My gaze landed on the worn leather recliner tucked into the corner near the hallway arch. My father, Tom, had remained seated throughout the entire ordeal. He had watched his wife plan the theft of my equity. He had watched his younger daughter tear down his granddaughter's bedroom. He had watched the affluent guests flee the house in disgust. He had listened to the screaming, the crying, and the ultimatums without ever standing up. He was a man who specialized in absence. He survived his marriage to Brenda by shrinking into the background, retreating into a comfortable, cowardly silence whenever conflict erupted. He enabled the toxicity by refusing to challenge it. The room was collapsing around him. His wife was facing imminent arrest. His living situation was terminated. The illusion of the Atwood family was permanently destroyed. I stared at him holding the heavy manila folder at my side. He had sat in that chair for 3 years, eating food I bought with extra nursing shifts, ignoring the slow, methodical theft of my life. Would the sheer, undeniable reality of the sheriff's cruiser finally snap him out of his complicit coma? Would the man who watched this entire nightmare unfold from a comfortable distance finally stand up and defend the daughter who gave him a roof when he had nowhere else to go? The flashing red and blue lights of the sheriff's cruiser painted shifting, colorful shadows across the walls of my living room. The steady, silent pulse of the light bar was a ticking countdown clock. The air felt heavy, dense with the realization that the long war was finally over. The quiet was broken by the creak of old leather. My father, Tom, placed his hands on the armrests of his recliner and pushed himself upright. He moved stiffly, as though gravity had suddenly doubled its hold on him. He looked incredibly small. The years of passive enabling, of retreating into the background while his wife tore through the lives of everyone around her, had hollowed him out. He looked old, terrified, and utterly exposed. He took a hesitant step toward the center of the room, leaving the safety of his corner. He did not look at Brenda, who stood frozen near the window. He did not look at Sloan, who remained curled in a pathetic heap on the floor. He walked directly toward me, raising his hands in a weak, pleading gesture. "Fair, sweetie," he began, his voice raspy and uncertain. "Please, you have to stop this. Do not do this to your mother. Do not do this to your sister." He stopped a few feet away, his eyes darting toward the front window and the waiting deputy. "Where will we go, Fair?" he asked, his tone breaking with a desperate, pathetic whine. "We do not have anywhere else. We are family. You cannot put your own parents out on the street. You have to have some mercy. We can sit down and figure this out together." I stared at him. For 30 years, this man's passive silence had been the structural glue holding my mother's tyranny together. He was the great pacifier, the man who always urged me to apologize first, to surrender my boundaries, and to absorb the abuse just to keep the peace at the dinner table. He never threw a punch, but he always held my arms behind my back while Brenda delivered the blows. I looked at his pleading face, expecting to feel a pang of daughterly guilt or a surge of residual affection. I felt nothing. The emotional reservoir I kept reserved for him was bone dry. I kept my hand firmly on Harper's shoulder, ensuring she stayed safely behind my legs. I did not raise my voice, but I hardened my tone until it felt like striking a piece of flint against steel. "You watched your 7-year-old granddaughter cry while her bedroom was ripped apart by her aunt." I said the words dropping into the room like heavy stones. "You sat in that chair. You turned up the volume on the television so you would not have to hear her sob. You ignored her pain because intervening would have required you to confront your wife. Tom flinched, physically, stepping back as though struck. He lowered his pleading hands, his eyes dropping to the hardwood floor. "You lost the right to ask me for mercy, Dad," I continued, my voice a deadly, unyielding whisper. "You lost the right to invoke the word family the day you chose your own comfortable peace over my child's physical and emotional safety. You are not a mediator. You are an accomplice, and your time in my house has expired." I pointed down the hallway toward the guest bedrooms. "Start packing, Dad. You have 2 hours and 45 minutes left before I walk outside and hand that folder to the deputy." Tom's shoulders slumped. The last remaining illusion of his paternal authority evaporated. He did not argue. He did not attempt another plea. He simply nodded his head, a slow, defeated gesture, and shuffled past me down the hallway to find empty cardboard boxes. The dam broke. The reality of the deadline crashed over Brenda and Sloan. The frantic, humiliating scramble began. Sloan scrambled up from the floor, her expensive cream suit smeared with dust. She sprinted down the hall toward Harper's ruined bedroom, desperate to salvage whatever personal belongings she had stashed in the closets. Brenda let out a low, panicked curse. She abandoned her ruined matriarchal posture and scurried toward the master suite she had planned to steal, frantic to gather her expensive clothes and hidden credit cards before the countdown expired. I did not offer to help them. I did not provide them with packing tape or heavy-duty garbage bags. I turned my back on the chaos and walked into the kitchen. Harper followed me, clutching her bear tightly against her chest, her eyes wide as she processed the sudden, chaotic reversal of power. I lifted Harper onto one of the tall bar stools at the center island. I pulled a fresh juice box from the refrigerator, popped the small straw through the foil seal, and handed it to her. She took it with a small, hesitant smile. I kissed the top of her head. I walked over to the cocktail table near the patio doors. I picked up one of the abandoned crystal champagne flutes poured by Brenda for her grand toast. The liquid was no longer chilled, but it did not matter. I walked back to the kitchen island, sat on the bar stool next to my daughter, and took a slow, deliberate sip. For the next 2.5 hours, I sat in my kitchen and watched the destruction of the Atwood Empire. It was a pathetic, uncoordinated retreat. Brenda shoved designer dresses and expensive shoes into black plastic trash bags, dragging them down the hallway and out the front door, throwing them haphazardly into the trunk of her sedan. Tom carried out armfuls of tangled electronic cords, old paperwork, and half-packed cardboard boxes, his head bowed, avoiding eye contact with the deputy parked just a few yards away. Sloan was a frantic blur of motion. She hauled armfuls of clothing, makeup palettes, and personal electronics out to her compact car. She cursed loudly when a trash bag ripped open on the front porch, spilling her expensive lip glosses across the concrete steps. She scrambled on her hands and knees to retrieve them, terrified that the watching sheriff would mistake her panic for a violent outburst. I sat at the quartz island sipping the warm champagne, observing my abusers furiously stuff their lives into the trunks of their vehicles, under the looming, undeniable threat of a prison sentence. The house grew progressively emptier, the oppressive weight of their presence lifting from the rooms with every bag they carried out the door. By 3:45 in the afternoon, the cars parked in the driveway were visibly sagging under the weight of their rushed packing job. Brenda stood near her open trunk, her face flushed and streaked with sweat, slamming the lid down on a final bag of shoes. Tom sat in the passenger seat, staring blankly through the windshield at the flashing cruiser lights. The deadline was approaching. The extraction was nearly complete. I set my empty champagne flute in the kitchen sink. I stood up and walked down the hallway toward the front foyer, intending to lock the deadbolt the moment their cars pulled away from the curb. But as I reached the entryway, Sloan emerged from the hallway leading to Harper's ruined bedroom. She was breathing heavily, her face red and smeared with old makeup. She was not carrying a trash bag of clothing or a box of personal toiletries. She was dragging the massive, heavy metal bases of her expensive circular ring lights, the cords trailing behind her like a tangled black tail. In her other hand, she held a large professional-grade camera gimbal. She was attempting to walk out the front door with thousands of dollars of technical equipment. Equipment purchased to build a fake business. Equipment purchased using my stolen emergency medical credit card. As she dragged the heavy metal bases across the hardwood, gouging a long scratch into the floor, what did she plan to do when she reached the threshold of my front door? The digital clock on the kitchen wall glowed in bright green numbers. It was 10 minutes to 4. The heavy, humid Indiana air outside had finally broken, releasing a sudden driving rainstorm that hammered against the living room windows. The flashing red and blue lights of the sheriff's cruiser cut through the gray downpour, a relentless reminder that the clock was about to run out. Sloan struggled down the hallway, the heavy metal bases of her professional ring lights scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. She held the expensive camera gimbal clutched tightly against her chest, treating it like a life preserver. She was panting, her tailored suit ruined by dust and sweat, desperate to salvage the last remaining pieces of her fractured influencer fantasy. "These are my business assets," Sloan announced, breathing heavily as she reached the entryway. Her voice carried a defensive, nervous edge. She refused to make eye contact with me, keeping her gaze locked on the open front door. "I need this equipment for my brand. I am taking it with me." Behind her, Brenda emerged from the kitchen. My mother carried a large canvas tote bag filled with her expensive cosmetics. She stopped near the center island, her eyes locked onto the gleaming chrome espresso machine sitting on the quartz countertop, the $1,200 appliance she had purchased just 3 days prior. Brenda reached out her fingers, wrapping around the heavy, braided power cord, preparing to yank the plug from the wall socket. I moved with the sudden, sharp efficiency of an ER nurse clamping a severed artery. I stepped forward and placed my open palm flat against the top of the chrome espresso machine. The metal was cold. I pressed down hard, anchoring the heavy appliance to the countertop. "Leave it," I commanded. My voice was low, carrying no trace of anger, only absolute, unyielding authority. Brenda snatched her hand back as if the power cord had suddenly sparked. She stared at me, her face twisting into a mask of indignant fury. "That is my machine," Brenda hissed, her eyes darting toward the front window and the waiting deputy. "I bought it. It belongs to me. You cannot legally keep my personal property." I did not move my hand. I looked directly into her eyes, letting the cold reality of the situation settle over her. "You did not buy this machine, Mom," I stated, enunciating every word with deliberate precision. "You purchased this appliance, and those ring lights your daughter is currently dragging across my floor using the Visa card ending in 4822. The emergency medical credit line that is registered exclusively in my name. The account you drained to the limit." I turned my gaze toward Sloan, who stood frozen in the foyer, the heavy metal bases resting awkwardly against her shins. "None of this equipment belongs to your brand, Sloan," I continued, my voice carrying clearly over the sound of the rain lashing against the windows. "It was purchased with stolen funds. That makes it evidence in a fraud investigation." Sloan opened her mouth, her face flushing a deep, mottled red. Her instinct was to scream, to throw a tantrum, to unleash the toxic defensive volume that had protected her for her entire life. She drew a deep breath, preparing to shatter the quiet house with a hysterical demand for her property. I did not let her exhale. I raised my left hand and pointed a single finger directly at the front window. The red and blue strobe lights from the cruiser pulsed steadily through the glass, illuminating the dark, rainy street. "Scream, Sloan," I challenged, dropping my voice to a lethal whisper. "Throw a tantrum. Make a scene. The deputy parked in my driveway is currently waiting for a reason to step out of his vehicle. If you want to argue about who legally owns the camera equipment purchased with a stolen credit card, we can walk outside right now and ask the officer to run a check on the receipts inside my manila folder." The threat hit her like a physical blow. The air rushed out of Sloan's lungs in a pathetic, defeated gasp. The reality of a felony charge crushed her final surge of entitlement. She looked down at the expensive camera gimbal in her hands, realizing it was not a business asset. it was a pair of handcuffs waiting to snap shut. She slowly lowered the gimbal to the floor, setting it down next to the heavy ring light bases. She backed away from the equipment, her hands raised in a gesture of total surrender. That equipment, along with the espresso machine, stays here. I finalized, turning my attention back to Brenda. It stays here as collateral for the $500 you wired to Greg to abduct my daughter. It stays here as collateral for the $14,000 of debt you racked up in my name. Now get out of my house. Brenda stood in the kitchen, her canvas tote bag clutched tightly against her side. She looked at the chrome espresso machine, then at the ring lights sitting abandoned in the foyer. She looked at the flashing police lights through the window. The entire structure of her power had collapsed. She had no audience left to manipulate, no lies left to spin, and no money left to steal. She turned her gaze to me, delivering one last look of pure, venomous, unfiltered hatred. It was the look of a parasite, realizing the host had finally severed the connection. It was a silent promise of eternal estrangement, a confirmation that the Atwood family was permanently dead. She did not say another word. She turned on her heel, her low shoes clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She walked down the hallway, brushing past Sloane without offering a word of comfort. She stepped out onto the front porch, the driving rain instantly soaking her expensive blazer, and marched toward her overloaded sedan. Sloane followed, a moment later, her shoulders hunched, her head bowed in humiliation. She walked out into the downpour, leaving the front door standing wide open. I stood in the entryway and watched them go. Brenda slammed the trunk of her car shut, the noise muffled by the heavy rain. She climbed into the driver's seat. Tom sat motionless on the passenger side, staring blankly ahead. Sloane scrambled into her compact vehicle, turning the ignition over in a hurried panic. The taillights of their cars flared bright red in the gray afternoon. Brenda shifted her sedan into gear and pulled away from the curb, accelerating quickly down the flooded street. Sloane followed closely behind, the tires of her car splashing through a deep puddle. Within 30 seconds, their vehicles disappeared around the corner, swallowed by the storm. The Marion County Sheriff's cruiser remained parked in the driveway for another 2 minutes, verifying the departure. Then the red and blue light bar clicked off. The deputy shifted the cruiser into drive and slowly rolled away, his job complete. I reached out, grabbed the heavy brass handle of my front door, and pulled it shut. I engaged the deadbolt, the loud, solid click echoing through the empty hallway. The house was instantly enveloped in a profound, ringing silence. It was not the tense, suffocating quiet of a battlefield waiting for the next artillery strike. It was the deep, expansive silence of a sanctuary that had finally been reclaimed. The crushing weight of 30 years of emotional manipulation, financial theft, and domestic gaslighting had simply vanished, driving away in the pouring rain. I stood in the foyer alone. My heart rate slowed to a steady, even rhythm. I took a deep, full breath of air, smelling only the faint, lingering scent of the abandoned catering spread. I felt a small, warm hand slip into mine. I looked down. Harper stood beside me, having padded silently out from the master bedroom in her socks. She clutched her stuffed bear under her left arm, her right hand holding tightly to my fingers. She looked up at me, her wide eyes searching my face for confirmation. "Are they gone, Mama?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I knelt down on the hardwood floor, bringing myself level with her. I wrapped both of my arms around her small frame and pulled her into a fierce, tight embrace. I buried my face in her soft hair, feeling the solid, undeniable reality of her presence. "They are gone, baby," I promised, my voice thick with a sudden, overwhelming surge of relief. "They are never coming back." Harper squeezed my neck tightly, letting out a long, shuddering sigh. She pulled back slightly, looking down the hallway toward the closed door of her ruined bedroom. "What do we do now?" she asked. I looked down the hall at the closed door, thinking of the sterile gray primer that had erased her painted forest. The invaders had been physically removed, the legal boundaries had been firmly established, and the financial bleeding had been stopped. but the damage they inflicted on my daughter's safe space remained. With the toxic elements finally purged from our lives, how would we begin the process of rebuilding the sanctuary they had tried so ruthlessly to destroy? The Sunday morning sun burned away the last remnants of the storm, casting bright, clear light across my wet gravel driveway. At 8 o'clock sharp, a white commercial van pulled up to the curb. A licensed locksmith stepped out carrying a heavy canvas tool bag. I met him on the front porch and handed him the old keys to my house. I instructed him to drill out every single cylinder on the property. I stood in the foyer and listened to the high-pitched whine of his power drill, cutting through the brass hardware. He replaced the front door deadbolt, the side garage entry, and the sliding patio lock. He handed me a ring of freshly cut silver keys. The metal felt cool and heavy in my palm. The physical perimeter of my home was officially sealed. The old keys circulating in my mother's purse or my sister's pockets were now nothing more than useless pieces of jagged metal. The physical barriers were only the first layer of defense. The legal perimeter required equal attention. On Monday morning, before my hospital shift began, I drove to Harper's Elementary School. I walked into the administrative office and handed the principal a thick file. Patricia Vance, my real estate attorney, had spent her weekend drafting a binding legal directive. The paperwork revoked all unauthorized pickup permissions. I established a strict, unassailable boundary. Greg was removed from the authorized list. Brenda was flagged in the primary security system. The administrative staff scanned the documents into their database, ensuring my mother could never again arrive at a classroom door and manipulate a teacher into handing over my child. Returning to my quiet house that afternoon, my cell phone vibrated against the quartz kitchen island. It was a familiar rhythmic buzzing. The Atwood House group chat had dissolved into a panicked silence, but the individual text messages from the extended family were flooding my screen. The Ohio aunts had mobilized. They operated under the delusion that family ties functioned as a blanket pardon for any toxic behavior. I picked up the phone and scrolled through the incoming notifications. "Your father is sleeping on a borrowed couch," one aunt wrote, layering the guilt into every syllable. "He is an old man, Fair. How can you throw your own blood out into the rain?" A second message followed from a cousin. "Your mother is devastated. She was only trying to help Sloan get on her feet. Family forgives each other. You need to call her and apologize for escalating things." I read the messages with a slow, steady pulse. A year ago, those texts would have triggered a severe anxiety response. I would have drafted long, desperate paragraphs trying to explain my side of the story, begging them to understand the fraud and the manipulation. I would have twisted myself into knots seeking their validation. I did not type a single letter in response. I simply tapped the contact icon at the top of the screen and selected the block option. I repeated the process for the second aunt and then the cousin. I severed the digital cords one by one. I did not owe them an explanation. They were demanding I set myself on fire to keep my abusers warm, and I refused to hold the match any longer. The following Saturday arrived, bringing the first free weekend I had experienced in 3 years. The house belonged entirely to us. I took Harper by the hand and we drove to the local hardware store. The aisles smelled of cut pine and floor wax. We walked back to the paint department. We spent an hour examining the color swatches under the fluorescent lights. We selected a matte white base, a deep charcoal gray, and a soft, shimmering silver to recreate the bark of the trees. Before we left the store, we walked down the novelty aisle and found a large plastic packet filled with luminescent glow-in-the-dark stars. We returned to Broad Ripple and opened the door to the ruined corner bedroom. The sterile, lifeless primer Sloan had rolled onto the drywall stared back at us, a lingering ghost of her failed vanity project. We laid heavy canvas drop cloths over the hardwood floor. I poured the matte white paint into a plastic tray. I handed Harper a small roller, and I took the large one. Together, we began covering the gray walls. The physical exertion felt like a necessary cleansing ritual. With every upward stroke of the roller, we erased their footprint from our lives. We painted over the spot where the shipping racks were supposed to stand. We painted over the corner where the ring lights had cast their artificial glare. We took the room back, inch by inch. When the base coat dried, we opened the charcoal and silver tins. I used a natural sponge to dab the textured patterns of birch bark onto the white trunks, creating the illusion of a deep, sprawling forest. Harper used a tiny brush to add small green leaves to the painted branches. We spent the entire afternoon lost in the quiet, methodical rhythm of our art. As dusk settled over Indianapolis, casting long shadows through the bedroom window, we opened the plastic packet of stars. I set up the aluminum stepladder near the center of the room. I peeled the adhesive backing off the plastic shapes. Harper stood on the floor below me, pointing to the exact spots on the ceiling where she wanted the constellations to live. We mapped out a new galaxy, sticking the glowing shapes onto the fresh paint. When the ceiling was nearly full, I climbed down and handed the final, largest star to my daughter. Harper took the glowing plastic piece in her small hands. She climbed the first 2 steps of the ladder. She reached up high, stretching her arms toward the ceiling directly above the spot where her pillow would rest. She pressed the star firmly into the drywall, smoothing the edges down with her thumb. She climbed back down and stood beside me. I reached over and flicked off the overhead light switch. The room plunged into darkness, but the ceiling instantly ignited. Hundreds of soft, luminescent points of light washed the bedroom in a gentle blue glow. "What is that one called?" I asked, pointing to the large star she had just placed over her bed. "That is the safe star," Harper whispered, her eyes reflecting the pale light. "So we always know where home is." I pulled her into my side, resting my chin on the top of her head. People often perpetuate a dangerous myth about family dynamics. They think that being labeled the strong one means you possess an endless, infinite capacity to absorb abuse. They assume your strength is a shock absorber, designed to cushion the blows for everyone else in the room. They praise your resilience only because your resilience makes their bad behavior convenient. For 30 years, my mother handed me the title of the strong daughter as a mechanism to keep me compliant. She expected me to carry her debts, house her enabler husband, and fund my sister's delusions, all while sacrificing my own peace. But I learned the truth in the quiet aftermath of that failed launch party. True strength has nothing to do with endurance. True strength is the ability to recognize when the game is rigged. It is the realization that your silence is not a surrender. Sometimes your silence is just the cold, calculated sound of a trap being meticulously set. I drew a hard, legal boundary to protect my daughter's sanctuary. In doing so, I finally learned how to protect myself. The Atwood family voted to erase us, but they forgot to check who actually owned the ground they were standing on. If you have ever been outvoted in your own life, or if you have ever been asked to set yourself on fire to keep a toxic family member warm, let this story be your reminder to change the locks. Drop a comment below and share your own quiet victory. Hit the subscribe button to join our community. And remember, no matter how loud they yell, you hold the deed. I will see you in the next one.